In the quiet town of Redwood Pines, nestled between rolling hills and winding roads, life moved at a steady pace. The townsfolk were simple, working class people who enjoyed their days fishing by the lake, sipping coffee at Marla's diner, and exchanging stories at the local gas station. But one thing they all held in common was a deep respect for the unspoken code of the West: loyalty, justice, and looking out for your own. And in Redwood Pines, no man had a reputation bigger than Clint Eastwood. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Though Eastwood had long since retired from Hollywood's bright lights, he had found solace in the quiet corners of California, living out his days in a sprawling ranch just outside town. He kept to himself, rarely making a fuss, but whenever he did stroll into town, heads turned, whispers floated through the air, and even the most hardened of men straightened their backs in his presence. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a legend on the silver screen. He was an icon of justice, a symbol of old-school grit and determination. But not everyone in Redwood Pines had the same level of respect. One such individual was a man named Ricky Mad Dog Malone, a biker with a mean streak longer than the highway he rode on. Ricky had come to town 6 months ago, rolling in on a battered Harley, covered in tattoos that told a story of violence, crime, and chaos. He was the kind of man who took pleasure in watching others suffer, a bully in every sense of the word. His favorite pastime? Picking on the weak, and in his twisted mind, that included animals. The trouble started small. At first, it was just rumors that Ricky had a habit of scaring stray dogs by revving his motorcycle at them, or tossing empty beer cans at them when they wandered too close. Then came the more sinister acts. Dogs found limping down Main Street, bruised and frightened, their tails tucked between their legs. It didn't take long before people started whispering about the sick pleasure Ricky seemed to get from kicking dogs for fun. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Ricky found himself cruising down the dusty back roads near a secluded stretch of land. His engine rumbled through the silence, sending birds scattering from the treetops. That's when he spotted it. A golden retriever, its fur thick and well-groomed, sniffing idly at the dirt path. Ricky grinned, feeling that familiar itch in his gut. Another dog. Another chance for some fun. He slowed his bike, rolled his shoulders, and planted his boot firmly on the ground as he dismounted. The retriever, oblivious to the danger, wagged its tail, stepping closer with a friendly curiosity. Ricky's smirk widened. "Stupid mutt," he muttered. Then, without hesitation, he pulled his leg back and delivered a hard, brutal kick to the dog's side. A yelp echoed through the trees as the retriever tumbled onto the dirt, rolling onto its back in pain. Ricky laughed. Before he could take another step, the air changed. A voice, low, steady, carrying the weight of 1,000 westerns, cut through the evening haze. "That," the voice said, slow as a drawl, "was a mistake." Ricky froze. His blood turned ice cold. He turned slowly, his laughter dying in his throat. Standing a few yards away, leaning against a fence post, was Clint Eastwood. The old man's silhouette was unmistakable, framed by the amber light of the setting sun. A cowboy hat sat low over his piercing gaze, the lines of his face etched with a lifetime of experience. He didn't need a gun in his hand to be dangerous. His presence alone was enough to make grown men swallow their pride. Ricky tried to play it off, shrugging with a smirk. "What's it to you, old man?" Eastwood stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The dog whimpered, struggling to its feet, and Eastwood reached down, running a calloused hand over its head, murmuring something too soft for Ricky to hear. The retriever's tail gave a weak wag. Then Eastwood straightened and fixed Ricky with a look that sent a shiver down his spine. "You got no respect," Eastwood said, his voice gravelly as ever. "Not for animals, not for this town, not for anything." Ricky scoffed, trying to ignore the knot forming in his stomach. "You gonna lecture me, old-timer?" he sneered, gripping his leather jacket. "You're just some washed-up movie star. Ain't like you're the sheriff or nothing." Eastwood's eyes never wavered. "I don't need a badge to deal with men like you." Ricky felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He had spent his life dealing with punks, outlaws, and rowdy bikers, but none of them had the quiet, dangerous stillness that Clint Eastwood possessed. It was like staring down the barrel of a loaded gun, except the gun didn't need to fire to put fear in your soul. For the first time in a long time, Ricky felt small. Still, his pride wouldn't let him back down so easily. He spat at the ground. Yeah? What are you gonna do about it? Eastwood didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them in two slow strides. When he stopped, Ricky felt suffocated by the weight of his presence. Eastwood tilted his head just slightly. I could break your legs, he said. Could leave you in the dirt. Let you feel what it's like to be kicked when you're down. Ricky swallowed hard, but that'd be too easy. Eastwood's lips curled just barely. And I don't like easy. Before Ricky could react, Eastwood moved. One swift motion, a hand gripping his collar, a boot hooking behind his knee, and suddenly Ricky was on the ground, flat on his back, his breath knocked from his lungs. The world spun. Pain bloomed across his spine. By the time he sucked in a ragged breath, Eastwood was standing over him, his shadow stretching long in the fading light. I see you in my town again, Eastwood said, voice dangerously quiet. I'll bury that bike of yours so deep, you'll have to dig to hell to find it. Ricky didn't move, didn't dare. The dog, now standing beside Eastwood, let out a low growl. Ricky scrambled to his feet, tripping over himself in his hurry to back away. He barely made it onto his bike before kicking up dust, peeling out down the road without a single glance back. By the time he reached the town limits, he knew one thing for certain. Redwood Pines wasn't a place for men like him, not when Clint Eastwood was watching. Back at the ranch, Eastwood knelt beside his dog, rubbing its ears. The retriever licked his hand, its tail wagging once more. Good boy, Eastwood murmured. Then, standing tall, he watched the road disappear into the horizon. Justice had been served. The West, after all, never forgets. The next morning, the town of Redwood Pines awoke to an unusual calm, the kind that followed a storm. The news of the encounter between Ricky Mad Dog Malone and Clint Eastwood had spread like wildfire. Every table at Marla's Diner buzzed with murmurs. Every seat at the barbershop was filled with speculation. People had seen Malone's bike tearing out of town the night before, the roar of his engine fading like the echo of a bad memory. By now it was clear. He wasn't coming back. And if he had any sense at all, he'd make sure his tires never touched the roads of Redwood Pines again. At the general store, Old Man Chester, who had lived in town longer than most had been alive, leaned against the counter and nodded sagely as he spoke to a group of locals. That Eastwood, he said, pushing his hat back on his head, he ain't just some Hollywood tough guy, he's the real deal. A young man, Tommy Jenkins, a mechanic at the gas station, grinned. I always figured those old westerns of his weren't far off from the truth. Man looks at you like you just insulted his horse, and suddenly, you don't feel so big anymore. Laughter rippled through the shop, but underneath it was a shared understanding, a respect that ran deeper than words. But if the townsfolk were celebrating the departure of a menace, Eastwood himself wasn't. Out on his ranch, the golden retriever, whom he'd named Duke after John Wayne, trotted beside him as he went about his morning routine. Feeding the horses, checking the fences, making sure the land was as it should be, Eastwood wasn't one for grand gestures, and he certainly didn't see himself as a hero. He had simply done what needed to be done. That's how it had always been. He wasn't the kind of man to sit back and watch as someone took advantage of the weak. He'd lived by that code his whole life. As he finished tightening a fence post, Duke barked suddenly, ears perking up. Eastwood turned, following the retriever's gaze. A dust cloud rose from the road leading to his ranch. A car, an unfamiliar one, was kicking up dirt, heading straight for him. He wiped his hands on his jeans, keeping his expression unreadable. He never got visitors unless they were expected, and this car wasn't familiar. As it rolled to a stop, the engine clicked and whined, the kind of sound that told him the vehicle had seen better days. The door opened, and out stepped a woman, tall, lean, with dark hair pulled into a ponytail. She had sharp eyes, the kind that didn't miss much, and she moved with purpose. She shut the door and crossed the distance between them in quick strides, stopping a few feet away. Duke stood at attention but didn't growl. "You Clint Eastwood?" she asked, her voice steady. Eastwood didn't answer right away. He studied her, taking in the way her hands rested at her sides, fingers slightly curled like she was always prepared for a fight. The kind of posture that came from years of being in dangerous situations. "Depends who's asking," he said finally. The woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a badge, flipping it open just long enough for him to read the letters. U.S. Marshal. Well, that was interesting. "Marshal Kelly Raines," she said. "I heard you had a run-in with a guy named Ricky Malone last night." Eastwood tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. News travels fast. Raines smirked. Faster when you're already looking for someone. She slid the badge back into her pocket. Malone's wanted in 3 states. Armed robbery, assault, a couple of missing persons cases that we haven't pinned on him yet, but we have our suspicions. Eastwood wasn't surprised. He'd known men like Malone before. Bullies didn't just stop at picking on animals. It always escalated. "So," he said, leaning against the fence, "what do you want from me?" Raines sighed, glancing around the quiet ranch. "I want to know if you have any idea where he might have gone." Eastwood shook his head. "I sent him running. Don't much care where he ran to." Raines nodded as if she expected that answer. "Figured as much. But here's the thing. Men like Malone, they don't just disappear. When they're cornered, they get desperate. And desperate men do stupid things." Eastwood didn't argue with that. "He's going to come back," she continued. "Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And he's going to have a score to settle." Eastwood's expression didn't change, but something in the air shifted. A quiet understanding passed between them. He wasn't afraid, but he knew she was right. "Appreciate the warning," he said. Raines studied him for a moment, then nodded. "If you hear anything, you let me know." Eastwood didn't answer, and she seemed to take that as a sign that the conversation was over. Without another word, she turned back to her car and drove off, leaving a fresh trail of dust behind her. Eastwood watched her go, then looked down at Duke. "Looks like we might have a visitor soon," he said. Duke wagged his tail, as if unfazed by the whole ordeal. Eastwood exhaled slowly. He hadn't been looking for a fight, but if Malone was coming back, then he'd make sure the man never had the chance to hurt another dog, or another person, ever again. Days passed, and the town remained peaceful. But Eastwood knew better than to trust the quiet. It was late one evening when it happened. He was on his porch, rocking back and forth in his chair, a cool breeze rolling through the valley. Duke lay beside him, chin resting on his paws. Then a sound, faint but distinct. The rumble of a motorcycle engine. Eastwood didn't move. He just listened. The sound grew closer, but it wasn't coming up the main road. It was sneaking around the back of his property. Duke's ears perked up, his body going rigid. "Yeah," Eastwood murmured. "I hear it too." He stood stretching slowly. He didn't need a gun, didn't need much at all. Instead, he walked down the porch steps, taking his time. The night stretched wide and silent, save for the distant chirping of crickets. Then, a flash of movement. Ricky Malone stepped out of the tree line, a crowbar in hand, his face twisted with rage. "You thought you could humiliate me?" Malone spat, his voice laced with venom. "You thought you could just run me out of town like I was some stray dog?" Eastwood exhaled, as if he'd been expecting this exact moment. "You should have stayed gone," he said simply. Malone lunged. The fight was over before it even began. Eastwood sidestepped the attack with the kind of grace that came from a lifetime of knowing when to move and when to strike. He caught Malone's arm, twisted it, and in one swift motion sent him crashing to the dirt. Malone groaned, rolling onto his back, but before he could recover, Eastwood planted a boot against his chest. "You don't belong here," Eastwood said, his voice steady, controlled. "And you're done hurting anything or anyone ever again." Malone struggled, but it was useless. Then, the sound of sirens. Headlights cut through the darkness, and within moments, Marshal Raines was there, stepping out of her vehicle with her gun drawn. "Didn't I tell you he'd be back?" she said, looking down at Malone with a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. Eastwood stepped back, letting her handle it. Malone, defeated, didn't even try to fight as she cuffed him. As she hauled him to his feet, she glanced at Eastwood. "You ever think about getting a badge?" she asked, half joking. Eastwood smirked. "I do just fine without one," she chuckled. "I figured." Then she nodded toward Duke, who was now wagging his tail happily. "That your dog?" Eastwood looked at Duke, then back at her. "Nah," he said, a rare softness in his voice. "He's family." As the patrol car drove away, Eastwood stood in the quiet once more, Duke at his side. The night stretched on, peaceful once again, and in Redwood Pines, justice had been served, Eastwood style. The weeks that followed Malone's arrest passed without incident. For the first time in a long while, Redwood Pines felt as it should, quiet, steady, and safe. The townsfolk went about their lives with a renewed sense of ease, as if a dark cloud had lifted. But for Clint Eastwood, the feeling of finality never truly settled. Years of experience had taught him that trouble had a way of circling back when you least expected it. And Malone, as much as he was a coward, wasn't the type to act alone for long. There was always a bigger dog in the fight, always someone waiting in the shadows, looking to even the score. The sign of trouble came on a Sunday morning. Eastwood was at the town's only cafe, sitting in his usual spot near the window with a black coffee in hand. Duke lay at his feet, his golden fur catching the soft light streaming in. The diner was alive with its usual morning crowd, farmers talking about the upcoming harvest, young couples planning their futures, a few old-timers playing checkers in the corner. Then the door opened, and the air changed. Two men stepped inside, strangers. They were bikers, that much was obvious. They had the kind of swagger that came with years of thinking the world owed them something. One of them was tall and wiry, his arms covered in faded tattoos, his long hair tied back. The other was shorter, stockier, but no less dangerous looking, a jagged scar cutting across his jawline. Eastwood didn't move, didn't react. He just watched. The taller man glanced around the room, his gaze finally settling on Eastwood. His lips curled into a slow, deliberate smirk. "So, you're the old bastard that put my friend in jail." The diner went silent. Every eye turned toward Eastwood, but he didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the weight of their stares. He simply set his coffee cup down, his movements slow and controlled. "Your friend made his choices," Eastwood said, his voice calm. "I just made sure he paid for them." The stocky biker scoffed. "That's so." Duke let out a low growl, sensing the tension. Eastwood reached down, scratching the dog's head, never taking his eyes off the two men. "What's this about?" he asked. The taller biker stepped forward, placing both hands on the table. "Malone's got friends. People who don't take kindly to old men sticking their noses where they don't belong." Eastwood tilted his head slightly. "That's supposed to scare me?" The biker chuckled, shaking his head. "Not yet, but it should. See, Malone might be locked up, but we ain't. And we don't like loose ends." Eastwood held his gaze. "You calling me a loose end?" "Something like that." The stocky man cracked his knuckles. "We're just here to let you know that this ain't over. Malone's got a crew and they don't forget." Eastwood let a beat pass before responding. "Neither do I." Something about the way he said it made both men hesitate. There was no bravado in his tone, no show of aggression, just certainty. Like he had already decided how this would end. The taller man's smirk faltered. He glanced at his companion, then back at Eastwood. "You got no idea who you're messing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Eastwood said, standing. "A couple of boys who think they're mean enough to scare an old man." The diner held its breath. The two bikers tensed, clearly debating whether to push the situation further. But something in Eastwood's gaze stopped them. Maybe it was the quiet confidence, the unshakable presence of a man who had seen and done more than they could ever imagine. Or maybe it was the simple fact that he wasn't afraid. Either way, they backed off, for now. The taller man straightened. "Enjoy your coffee, old man, while you still can." Then, just like that, they turned and left. As the door swung shut behind them, the tension in the room eased. Conversation slowly resumed, but there was an underlying current of unease. Marla, the diner's owner, walked over with a fresh pot of coffee. "You all right, Clint?" Eastwood nodded. "For now." Marla poured him another cup, then leaned in, lowering her voice. "They ain't gonna let this go." Eastwood sighed, taking a sip. "Didn't expect them to." That night, Eastwood didn't sleep much. He sat on his porch, Duke beside him, watching the road. The land stretched out in the moonlight, vast and quiet. But even in the silence, he could feel it. The storm was coming, and when it did, he'd be ready. A week passed without another incident. But Eastwood wasn't fooled. The bikers weren't the type to let a grudge die quietly. If they were smart, they'd wait, plan, find the right moment. And that moment came one night, just after sunset. Eastwood had just finished tending to the horses when Duke's ears perked up. The retriever let out a low, warning growl, his stance shifting. Eastwood turned, scanning the property. Then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of motorcycles. Not just one or two, a dozen. The distant hum grew louder, closer, until headlights appeared at the far end of his long driveway. One by one, the bikes pulled up, their riders dismounting in the moonlight. They weren't hiding this time. They wanted to be seen, wanted him to know what was coming. Eastwood exhaled slowly. He had been expecting this. He walked to the porch, standing at the top of the steps as the bikers approached. Duke stayed close at his side, teeth bared. The leader stepped forward. The same tall, wiry man from the diner, only this time he wasn't smirking. "We gave you a chance," he said. "Told you to mind your business." Eastwood didn't respond, just watched. The biker gestured toward the men behind him. "Now we do this the hard way." Eastwood took a slow step forward. "That what you think?" The leader's eyes narrowed. "You're one man." Eastwood's lips twitched. "That's one more than you'll be able to handle." The biker scoffed. "That so?" Then he reached for a knife. Before he could even pull it from its sheath, something whistled through the air. A gunshot. The leader froze, his hand inches from his weapon. The bikers turned, looking toward the tree line. And there, standing in the shadows, was Marshal Kelly Raines, rifle in hand, badge gleaming. Behind her, more figures stepped into the open, deputies armed and ready. "You boys picked the wrong town," Raines said, voice steady. The bikers hesitated. Some shifted uneasily. They hadn't expected this. Eastwood smirked. "I don't need a badge," he said, "but I know people who do." The leader's jaw clenched. Raines stepped forward. "You want to do this?" she asked. "Because I'd be more than happy to put you in a cell right next to Malone." For a moment, no one moved. Then, the leader's shoulders dropped. He glared at Eastwood, then at Raines, then at the deputies. Finally, he spat on the ground. "This ain't over!" Raines didn't blink. "Yeah, it is." The bikers hesitated a moment longer. Then, one by one, they turned and climbed onto their bikes. Engines roared to life, headlights flicked on, and within moments, they were gone, disappearing into the night. The silence that followed was heavy. Raines lowered her rifle, exhaling. "You all right?" Eastwood nodded. "Fine." She gave him a look. "You knew they'd come." "Of course." Raines shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're something else, Eastwood." He shrugged. "Just an old man who doesn't like bullies." She chuckled, then glanced down at Duke, who was wagging his tail triumphantly. "You ever think about getting a new dog?" she asked. Eastwood looked down at Duke, then back at her. "Nah," he said. "This one's just fine." As the last traces of the bikers faded into the night, Eastwood stepped back onto his porch, Duke right beside him. The storm had passed, for now. But if it ever returned, he'd be ready, because some things never change. And justice, well, that's just a matter of time. The night settled into a quiet stillness, the kind that only comes after a storm. The air was thick with the scent of dust and the faint lingering of exhaust fumes from the bikers' departure. Eastwood remained on his porch, Duke sitting faithfully at his side, both of them watching the empty road as if daring trouble to return. Raines holstered her rifle and let out a slow breath. "They won't stop, you know," she said. "Not completely." Eastwood nodded. He knew that men like Malone's crew were like weeds. You cut them down and more always grew back. But he also knew something else. "They won't be back for a while," he said. Raines tilted her head. "And why's that?" Eastwood gave a knowing smirk. "Because they just learned a lesson." Raines crossed her arms, studying him. "That right?" Eastwood gestured toward the road where the bikers had vanished. "They came here expecting a fight they could win. Instead, they found a town that won't be bullied." "Men like that? When they realize they're not feared, when they see that people like you and me stand in their way, they think twice. They'll lick their wounds and go looking for easier prey." Raines sighed, kicking at the dirt with her boot. "I hope you're right." He turned his gaze toward the sky, where the stars shone bright and unbothered by the events of the night. He'd lived long enough to know that trouble never disappeared entirely, but there were victories in the small battles, and tonight, they'd won. Raines checked her watch. "I should get back to town," she said. "Make sure my deputies are keeping an eye out." Eastwood nodded. "Appreciate you showing up." She smirked. "Wasn't for you. Just figured Duke here could use some backup." At the sound of his name, Duke's ears perked up, and he gave a happy wag of his tail. Eastwood chuckled. "You ever think about getting a dog of your own?" he asked. Raines shrugged. "Thought about it, but I'm always on the move. Wouldn't be fair." Eastwood gave Duke a scratch behind the ears. "They make good company." Raines watched them for a moment before nodding. "Yeah," she said, "I can see that." She turned and headed for her vehicle. Just before climbing in, she called over her shoulder. "Try not to stir up too much trouble while I'm gone." Eastwood smirked. No promises. The patrol car's taillights faded into the distance, leaving the ranch in its usual quiet state. Eastwood stood there a moment longer, breathing in the night air. Then, without a word, he patted his leg and Duke followed him inside. As the screen door creaked shut behind them, Eastwood took one last glance at the road, then flipped off the porch light. Tomorrow would be another day, another sunrise, another moment of peace. And if trouble ever did come knocking again, well, he'd be waiting. The days that followed were eerily calm, as if the universe itself had decided to take a breath after the tension of the last few weeks. The air smelled sweeter. The wind carried a certain stillness. And for once, Clint Eastwood felt like he could enjoy the quiet without waiting for the other shoe to drop. Duke, as usual, took his cues from his master. With the bikers gone and no immediate threats lurking, the golden retriever spent his time trotting lazily through the fields, chasing the occasional rabbit, but never straying too far. Every now and then, Eastwood would catch the dog stopping near the road, sniffing the air as if making sure the ghosts of the past few days had truly vanished. "You and me both, Duke," Eastwood muttered, sipping his morning coffee on the porch. It wasn't long before the townsfolk started to settle back into their routine as well. Redwood Pines had a short memory when it came to trouble. They'd been through their fair share of hardships over the years: fires, droughts, the occasional drifter looking for the wrong kind of excitement. But they endured, just like they always had. At Marla's diner, the usual morning crowd had returned, though the conversation still lingered on recent events. "I heard that Malone's boys got pulled over 2 towns over," Old Man Chester announced, tapping the rim of his coffee cup. "Sheriff there says they were in a hurry to get out of the state." Tommy Jenkins, the young mechanic, grinned. "Guess they figured out real quick that this ain't the kind of place they want to mess with." Marla, never one to shy away from the truth, wiped down the counter and chimed in. "Ain't got nothing to do with the town. It's got everything to do with Eastwood." The room went silent for a moment, as if everyone collectively agreed but didn't want to say it too loudly. Chester chuckled. "Well, I reckon if I was some two-bit outlaw looking to make trouble, I wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of that man either." Across town, Marshall Raines was doing her own brand of cleanup. After the events of that night, she'd made sure Malone's arrest was airtight, and any remaining members of his gang were on the run. She'd even gotten word from neighboring counties, where a few of his associates had been picked up on unrelated charges. Still, she had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time she crossed paths with Eastwood. She drove out to his ranch one evening, more out of curiosity than necessity. When she pulled up, he was already on the porch, as if he'd been expecting her. "You checking in, Marshall?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. She smirked. "Just making sure trouble hasn't found its way back here." Eastwood took a slow sip of his drink. "Not yet," Raines nodded. "Good." The two sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun set over the hills. And for now, that was enough. The sun dipped lower, casting a golden hue over the rolling hills, stretching shadows long across Eastwood's ranch. The night air carried the scent of dry earth and pine, a familiar comfort in a world that was constantly changing. Raines leaned against the railing of the porch, arms crossed. "You ever get tired of it?" she asked. Eastwood raised an eyebrow. "Tired of what?" "This." She gestured toward the land, the solitude, the quiet, the waiting. Eastwood considered her question, his gaze drifting toward Duke, who lay contentedly at his feet. "Some men spend their whole lives looking for peace," he said. "I figure if you find it, you don't waste time wondering if it's enough." Raines nodded, understanding. She'd spent years chasing criminals, moving from one town to the next, never putting down roots. Maybe in a different life, she'd have chosen something simpler, something like this. "Well," she said, pushing off the railing, "if trouble comes back, you know where to find me." Eastwood smirked. "I don't reckon I'll need to." She chuckled, climbing into her truck. As she drove away, Eastwood exhaled slowly, watching the last light fade from the sky. For now, the west was quiet. The stars emerged, scattered across the vast sky like embers from an unseen fire. Eastwood remained on the porch, rocking slowly in his chair, listening to the sounds of the night, the distant call of an owl, the rustling of the wind through the trees. Duke let out a contented sigh, curling up beside him, his tail thumping lazily against the wooden planks. Eastwood took a final sip of his drink, the warmth settling deep in his chest. He had no illusions. Peace never lasted forever, but tonight it was his. And until trouble came knocking again, he would enjoy it. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on a biker kicking dogs for fun? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.